Nearly a century after the end of the Civil War and the dawn of Reconstruction, African Americans still found themselves fighting for their basic rights as citizens. The modern civil rights movement in the mid-20th century finally secured them.
Most historians actually date the start of the formal civil rights movement to Brown versus Board of Education. Brown really stokes the fervor of the nation. Then, in December of 1955, Rosa Parks decided as an act of resistance that she would not give up her seat to a white man on the bus.
Rosa Parks' deliberate act of resistance led to a bus boycott that thrust into the limelight a young preacher with a PhD. He would become one of the movement's most charismatic leaders. His name was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
One of the most iconic moments is the March on Washington in 1963, led by Martin Luther King Jr.
200,000 people converge on the nation's capital to rally for civil rights. They come united in one cause.
One day right now in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
This becomes visualized on the news and begins to change the way that Americans are starting to think about the civil rights movement.
As the civil rights movement attained greater visibility, it was often met with increased brutality and violence. Yet in the midst of so much sacrifice and heartbreak, the work of civil rights activists began to bear fruit.
In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of '64, and that's designed to desegregate businesses and government employment. And then in 1965, President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act of '65.
The passage of the Voting Rights Act was a monumental victory for African Americans. Tragically, just 3 years after it was passed, Dr. King would be assassinated. Many feel, looking back, that the movement died that day. But in fact, the movement took on new forms and continued. And it must continue today, as important victories such as the Voting Rights Act are under attack.
Until we deal with the fact that the backlash is often made possible not just by the other side growing in power, but by those who claim to care about equality losing their own resolve. There will be moments of this cycle happening over and over again.
Thank you for joining us today. I think we're at a very sober moment in US history. And as we saw in the very short video, that so many things have changed, but so much has stayed the same. My name is Karen Umemoto, and I'm the Helen and Morgan Chu Chair and Director of the Asian American Studies Center. I'd like to start today's program by acknowledging the Tongva peoples as the traditional caretakers of Tovangar, which is the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands. We're grateful to live with the indigenous peoples of this land and strive to be better caretakers for all who live here. Before I begin, I'd like to recognize our co-sponsors and co-organizers, starting with the Asian American Studies Department, East Wind E-Zine, the Association of Hmong Students, United Khmer Students, Vietnamese Student Union, the Asian Pacific Coalition, and Pacific Ties News Magazine at UCLA. The UCLA Asian American Studies Center, we just hit our 50th year milestone last year when we looked back at the founding of the Asian American Studies Center and ethnic studies in general, when Asian American, Black, Chicanx, and Native students fought for ethnic studies and affirmative action and for a more relevant and accessible education for all. We're forever grateful to their dedication and conviction, and we would not be here without their activism and advocacy and institution building over those years. In today's program, you'll have a chance to hear stories and the wisdom of Ed Nakawatase Marion Kwan, and Kabzuag, all veteran activists and organizers who traveled a path that opened up opportunities for the rest of us and who are still active today. In this program, we want to explore the meaning and forms of racial solidarity and see what connections might be made between the work of Asian Americans involved in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and those at the forefront of solidarity work in the movement for Black lives today. We're privileged to have such a wonderful intergenerational panel, and we look forward to their insights and to the conversation that will follow. I'd like to now turn the program over to our moderator, Kelly Fong. And just to say something about Kelly, she's a lecturer in the Asian American Studies Department at UCLA, and she's working on a project on LA Chinatowns with the Asian American Studies Center. She's currently teaching the course on the history of Asian Americans. And for those of you who are UCLA students, you might consider taking her class next quarter on the Asian American movement. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Kelly.
Thanks so much, Karen. Just to clarify, the Asian American movement class is actually spring quarter. So this spring. Yeah.
Sorry,
all right.
Thanks.
No worries. Before we get started, there are a few program guidelines that I want to cover before we begin, right? So we will be recording this session so that it can be shared at a later time. And if you do not wish to be recorded, please be sure to turn off your camera. The microphones are turned off for everyone except the speakers. We ask that everyone please stay muted, especially during the main program, to respect the speakers, as well as to allow everyone to hear the speakers. Feel free to use the reaction buttons to respond to the speakers or raise your glass of water, tea, coffee, etc. in cheer and appreciation. Questions may be submitted during the session in the chat tab for those of you who are on Zoom, and this is located at the bottom of the screen on most computers. If you have a question or comment directed at a specific speaker, please put their name in your comment or question. During our Q&A session, I will read the questions for the speakers and with your name, so that they will be read aloud so that attendees can hear the questions. The panel itself should be about 1 hour, and after the panel, we'll have time for Q&A. We do know that, however, that it is a full panel, and so that there may be more questions than that we're able to answer in this session. So please see our website for a recording of this program that will be posted later on. First, I want to introduce Eddie Wong. Eddie Wong is one of the student founders of the UCLA Asian American Studies Center, co-editor of Roots, an Asian American Reader, and co-founder of Visual Communications. He has also been a political organizer, a filmmaker, and community activist. So Eddie wants to say a few words before we get to our speakers.
Thank you for hosting this session. And just to let people know, East Wind e-zine is an online publication. So we cover art, politics, and I was able to, through the course of just doing a little bit of research, find 7 people who are active Asian Americans in the civil rights movement. So you're going to meet 2 of them very shortly, Ed and Marion. But I also want to acknowledge the stories of Vincent Wu, Joseph Ozawa, Carl Imiola Young, Tamio Wakayama, and also Alex Heng. And you can read all this at www.eastwindezine.com. Just one note of thanks also to Steve Louis, who helped do the interview with Ed, and to Pam Towley, who introduced me to Vincent Wu. I think you'll notice through all the stories that there was a sense of moral outrage and kind of a wokeness that happened in the early 60s as the news media started covering the civil rights activities in the South. And I think we're experiencing a similar moment today. So it's very rewarding to read these stories and learn more about these people directly. Also, just want to note that a few of them have passed away. So Tamio Wakayama, who was a photographer for SNCC, and you'll see some of his photographs in the next video, is no longer with us, but he left a very rich legacy. And also Carl Imiola Young, who was an activist who grew up in Hawaii, also passed away. But, you know, for most people who are active the civil rights movement left a lasting imprint on their lives. And Carl, for one, became an activist in the Hawaiian sovereignty movement. So please check out these stories. They're very rich. And then stay around, hopefully, for more stories at East Wind Easing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eddie. So now I want to introduce our speakers for today. So first, I want to introduce Ed Nakawatase, who worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, in Atlanta, Georgia from 1963 to 1964. He then went on to work with the American Friends Service Committee. He joined their Third World Coalition national staff and became their national representative for Native American Affairs, a position he held for 31 years before he retired. He's currently on the boards for Asian Americans United and the Folk Arts Cultural Treasures Charter School, both in Philadelphia, and the Seabrook Educational and Cultural Center in New Jersey. Next, we have Marion Kwan. Marion Kwan was active with the Delta Ministry from 1965 to 1966 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. She returned home to the San Francisco Bay Area, where she worked in jobs and roles involved with grassroots organizing, social protest, and education. She was a Chinatown YWCA Young Adult Program Director. She joined the Peace Caravan with the American Friends Service Committee. She did work with the International Rescue Committee in Hong Kong and was in anti-Vietnam War protests. Marion worked as an academic counselor for low-income students at City College of San Francisco. And she was a trainer for Community Boards, Inc., a dispute resolution neighborhoods program, and was a consultant for the Stanford Intercultural Communications Institute. Marion is now retired and is an active member of the San Francisco Bay Area Veterans and Civil Rights Movement. Kabzuag is the founder and co-executive director of Freedom, Inc., based in Madison, Wisconsin. She's a strong believer that those who are most deeply impacted must be at the forefront of the movement. Those who are most deeply impacted must have opportunities and resources to advocate for themselves and tell their own stories. In the past 20 years, Kabzuag has spent her life working to build collective power and social change within Southeast Asian and Black communities. She was recognized as a champion of change at the White House during Domestic Violence Awareness Month in 2011, and was named one of 20 women of color in politics to watch in 2020 by She the People. Her first love is the movement. So welcome, everyone. So what I want to do is actually start off by getting a little sense of your involvement in the movement and the work that you've done. So I'm actually going to start off with Ed. And Ed, could you please tell us a bit about how you got in the civil rights movement and how your activism has impacted you?
For me, the movement was something that built up over time. I mean, I can remember through the media, the papers and television, what was unfolding in the South. I mean, the integration of schools at Little Rock and other places. I'd read about the murder of Emmett Till and the bus boycott in Montgomery. And through the 50s, the late 50s, and then in the early 60s, I mean, you had the sit-in movement, you had the freedom rides. It acquired a kind of moral momentum that I couldn't resist, frankly. It played to a lot of things, including a general idealism and at least some notion that what was going on in the South wasn't right, and the proclivity to supporting the underdog. So it got to the point where by 1962, I mean, in 63, I was a freshman in college. And then the big story in 63 was the Birmingham movement. And I think I registered something in the back of my mind that said, I want to be a part of this. So of course, quite logically, I dropped out of college and went south. There were no applications, there were no interviews. I didn't know anybody, they didn't know me. I just hopped on a bus and I rode for about 24 hours and wound up in Atlanta and went to the SNCC office. I mean, it sounds crazy, and it is, but that's the way it happened. And I went into the office and SNCC. I talked to a couple of the staff people in the office. It was a good conversation. And basically, I was on board. I mean, they didn't kick me out. You know, they didn't say, well, who the hell are you? Which is a reasonable question under the circumstances. But I wound up doing kind of intake work at the office in SNCC, in which we sort of recorded what was going on with the program offices throughout the South, and then wrote them up. And then later I worked with the Student Voice, which was the newsletter of the organization, and worked on helping produce leaflets and posters and things like that for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and other campaigns. And then later I wound up on the research department in SNCC, where we explored the whole concept of the white power structures in the South and what the links were between economic and social and political power in the region. It was all fascinating stuff. You know, it was the seminal experience of my life, essentially. I mean, I would say it was the best thing I ever did. So, I mean, I'm not saying that everybody ought to hop on a bus and ride for a day, but I think that was a moment, one where it was possible. It will still seem crazy to a lot of people and irrational, but in the scheme of things, it was something I felt I had to do, and I'm glad I did.
That's great. Thank you so much. Marion, the same question I'm going to pose to you. Could you please tell us a bit about how you got involved in the civil rights movement and how your activism has impacted you?
Well, I think the best way for me to describe it is I have to go back to my roots. And I need to look at how I got to the movement was through being Chinese, about what it's like being inside a Black community and about being poor in America. Because I see the Chinese community and the Black community as both being poor. I was very familiar with race and class because my parents came through Angel Island, as well as my older sister, and she was 7 at that time. So I was born and raised in San Francisco's Chinatown. And I knew nothing about Blacks, and whites were tourists who would stare at me. And I'm used to it because I was, you know, my home was right on Grand Avenue, right in the heart of Grand Avenue for 16 years. Um, and if I can describe Chinatown for briefly, it's my family, it's my home. It's where everybody knew somebody. And we call our adult neighbors aunts and uncles. And it's a place where I felt comfortable and safe. But tourists who come here into Chinatown didn't know that it's the poorest, below poverty line of anywhere in the city. It's the most densely populated community in San Francisco. But it was still home for me. And the only time I felt like I was a minority was when I left the boundaries of Chinatown for school or to play somewhere. That's the time when I felt like I was a minority. But I was very active in a church at that time, Presbyterian church called Cameron House. And it was a politically conscious and community-oriented church where we got really involved in community. And so I decided after 2 years at City College, I felt really trapped. And I felt like I need to get away. So obviously I heard about a church-related college in Nebraska. That's where I ended up. And there was a professor who talked one day about this place called Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and about this organization called the Delta Ministry that was related to the National Council of Churches. It's the only civil rights group there that's sponsored by a church. So, and he talked about what's been happening down there. And I was deeply moved as a student. And I thought to myself, hey, I'm going to graduate in a month. Why don't I just go down there? So very much like Ed, I just felt like it was just spur of the moment. I just wanted to, I was so curious. So a classmate and I took the bus. Also, we took a bus and we went down south. And little did I know what I was getting myself into, because I didn't realize that Mississippi was the murder capital of the nation. They had more lynchings there than anywhere else in the country. And I didn't know that. And I guess one of the things that I realized when I got there was that everything was dirt poor. There was a community that I lived in for 2 summers. And you could tell where the Black community starts and where the white community ends. It's where the pavement ends. Pavement ends and you see a third world community for a couple of miles, and that's where the Blacks live. And at that time we called them Negroes. And I lived there for 2 summers with an elderly woman, Mrs. Sims. And speaking of feeling protected, she knew that she took me, when she took me in, I was a stranger to her. She didn't know me, I didn't know her. But the organization put us together, and she housed me knowing that she was in danger. And she was very brave to have done that. It wasn't very easy for her to take me in. So in the long run, that's what happened to me. And I did a lot of work with, I did a lot of grassroots organizing. I started with a girls' club. They were like 11 to 15 years old. And we helped do community canvassing, going door to door, getting neighbors to vote, to register to vote. And just some inside feeling about these kids they were so curious and so hungry for knowledge. They were really excited to meet me, a complete stranger. And I thought that they put me back into Chinatown when I was that age. I felt like I needed to get away from Chinatown. Like they really were dying to get out of the Black community, but unlike me, I could get out of the community, but they couldn't, because if they did, they may not end up coming home. They may be dead somewhere. And so they got to really, it was this feeling of so eager and so happy and so desperate to learn new things. And so when they kept asking me, can I speak some Chinese? And so when I spoke a few words of Chinese, they would double over and they would laugh, and it was so hilarious. And they were so excited to hear new things. So I just felt like there was a community there that I felt like the community there really trusted me with their kids. Integrating libraries, the YWCA, swimming pools. And I was very impressed with the fact that they really trusted me. So I think I want to bring up the idea of how the impact of another community, very different from mine, that there were so many similarities. That's the message I want to impart.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing a bit of that. Now I want to turn to our third speaker. Kabzuag, I know you're involved with a lot of work related to fighting for gender, queer, and racial justice. So could you tell us a bit about the work and how it's impacted you?
Sure. So, I mean, just a little bit about how I came into this work. I think that for many of us, we don't come into the work. The work has always been a part of our lives. And so I just want to say that for me, the movement or social justice movements and racial justice and gender justice was not a choice to whether or not I was going to be a part of this movement, but actually I had no choice. If I wanted a different type of life, if I wanted to live the way that I wanted to live and to see a world where I would thrive, I knew that I had to build that. And so at a very young age, like I did not see spaces where I could thrive, and I did not see spaces where my value was valued. And so from a very young age, I knew that I had to create a world that I wanted to live in. And I hoped along that road that I would then build family and community with people who also wanted the same thing. One of the things that I've learned in coming into this work was that at first it was very lonely. As a Southeast Asian woman, as a Hmong woman, and growing up, I was born in Laos at the end of the war. And when my family came here, we came here and really didn't have any infrastructure to survive and to thrive. And so my mother basically worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. And so one of the things that I learned very early on as a Hmong girl living in a very traditional Hmong household was that I didn't know what the terminology and the analysis around injustice, but I felt it. And I felt it in my bones, and I knew what that felt like. And so even prior to having language for explaining why I must fight in this world to make a world for myself, I knew what it felt like. And so I took that and I said, if it feels like this, if it feels like this for me as a Hmong woman, as a Hmong girl, if it feels like this for me as somebody who was seen as heterosexual and like the norm for people, then it must not feel right if you're queer. Then it must be harder if you're people who are most impacted. And so from a very young age, I think that I felt that fire inside of me, and without terminology, without analysis, I knew enough to say there's something better out here. And if it's not out here, I'm gonna create it for myself. And so that's how I came into this work at a very young age. I think that the mere fact that I was born at the end of the war, at the mere fact that I survived refugee camps, and then on top of that, survived assimilation in this country, survived poverty, and survived racism, misogyny. All of those things like really gave me a different lens as to how I was going to organize as a social justice organizer. And so I'm just saying that for me, from the start, I knew enough to know without terminology, without analysis, that I could not do and could not build a gender justice movement without including the queer justice piece. And then on top of that, understanding and growing up alongside Black and Brown communities, Southeast Asians, we were resettled in some of the poorest neighborhoods throughout the US with very little infrastructure to make sure that we survived. We are the deportation, all of the things that are happening to Southeast Asians in this country is a manifestation of the failed resettlement act of Southeast Asians in this country. And so because I come from that background, because I've seen my community and my people incarcerated at higher rates, the failure to educate and to give us proper resources in the education system, and seeing my people being routed from the school pipeline to the prison pipeline to the deportation pipeline, I think that this really informed me as a young person to how I was going to move in this world. And so, and then on top of that, growing up with predominantly Black communities and Black folks, I used to talk about it in the way that we lived on top of each other, next to each other, but we never built with each other. And that is very strategic in this country to keep our families and to keep those of us who are fighting for the same resources to hate each other and to like not build with each other, but to see each other as enemies and to see each other as people fighting and vibing for the same resources. And so my fight or my journey into working in solidarity with Black communities was something that was a natural thing that was coming, because my first experience of Americans was African Americans, were Black communities. And so for me, it wasn't the anti-Blackness piece was the fact that the communities were forced to be together, but not taught to learn how to be together. And that was very strategic of white supremacy. And so I learned very early on, even without, like I said, without terminology, without analysis, that this was something that didn't feel right. And so, yeah, that's my journey into social justice movements.
Hey, thank you so much. All three of your stories are incredibly powerful and inspiring, right? And so actually to build upon some of what all of you have shared right now, the next question I want to pose is, as a teacher, I get a lot of students are asking about what they're doing now, and particularly how to be an ally, right? As Asian Americans, how do we be an ally to Black communities? So I want to actually pose that question to you in terms of what does it mean to be an ally to Black communities, and how do you become one? So I'm gonna open that to any of you who want to give a response.
I wanted to lay out a story which has something to do with the kind of notion of who you are and with whom you deal in solidarity. A couple months in Atlanta in 1963, a bunch of us at SNCC went to a reception for the then Vice President of newly independent Kenya. And then after that reception, we went to a Toddle House, which was a chain of what we used to call greasy spoons. But you can get a cup of coffee and a piece of pie, that sort of thing. And obviously they hadn't fed us enough at the reception. So we went over there, and it became quite evident, probably as soon as we came in, that they weren't going to serve us as an interracial group. So we got rounded up and arrested. And it was a mixed group. It was both white and Black, women's staff with SNCC and Black male staff and me, essentially. And the moment of truth, or a moment of truth, came when we were going to be assigned to the jail, the city jail, which was of course segregated. And I volunteered that, hey, why don't you put me in jail with those guys? The guys came in here with. And I'll never forget this. The jailer looks at me and he says, well, you're not colored, which means at that time black, so you're white. And so I wound up in the Atlanta City Jail with a group of over-exuberant partiers from Oglethorpe University and a bunch of drunks, white drunks, obviously, off the streets of Atlanta. And I thought ever since about the stupidity of this whole thing, of this whole craziness of race as a category. And the guy couldn't even posit. I mean, I was sort of outside of his worldview or something. So I think of that. I mean, racism is horrible, and it's a terror, but it also is ridiculous. And that pointed that out to me. And so I think about that story in terms of alliances. I mean, I grew up in a community which was mostly JA. I mean, that's who I grew up with. And I didn't have black friends. I didn't know, I mean, it wasn't one of the routes that I took into the movement, but it was clear as I worked in SNCC that, this is part of what I'm a community, this is part of my community. And it was a damn sight safer than the white community that, about which we, danced around. So that's a personal experience, and it had all kinds of political ramifications later on. But it also showed to me both the seriousness and the ridiculousness of race and racism.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have any thoughts about what it means to be an ally to Black communities, and how can you become an ally?
I can go. So I think I tell this story a lot. Well, not as often as I should, but for a long time, like I said, we lived with each other, with Black folks, on top of each other, next to each other, but we never built community together. And so one of the things that I learned early on in the racial justice movement, or in social justice movement, was, how to show up as an ally. And so the allyship word has become really popular, and people are like, they think they can show up this way, or like learning how to be a good ally. And then when the uprising of Mike Brown happened, and we had been building Freedom Inc. as a Southeast Asian and Black organization. And so we had been learning how to be in community with each other and showing up for each other in different ways that people just didn't know. So when that happened, our Black staffs and folks that we were working with, they needed certain things. Like we would say, what do you need? We can drive you there, do whatever. And so we were learning how to be good allies and showing up in that time. And then I was preaching like, oh, you know what, if you build community with people, by the time they're in crisis, you don't have to ask them. So it's more than just allyship. Like, you actually have to be family, because when there's a crisis, you know what your family need. You may not know what allies need, but you know what your family needs. And so I was saying, hey, everybody, build family and not just allyship. And that way, when there's a crisis, you know, how annoying is it that you're going through a crisis and someone's like, what do you need? No, you already know what they need because you've been building family with them, right? And building community. And then, so I was preaching that during the Mike Brown uprising, and then George Floyd happened. And I said, you know what, like, it's more than just allyship. It's more than just building community and family. What I learned in this last uprising was that it isn't in service of Black people. What is my, like, if truly our liberation is tied to each other, what is it? What's the fight for me and for Hmong people and for Southeast Asian people? What is our story? And how is white supremacy something that we must eradicate? And not because we're in solidarity with Black people, but that white supremacy is actually harmful to our communities. what is my liberation fight? And so that when I'm showing up in the streets, and I'm going to give you this example, this quick example. So we were in the streets and we were marching right after the George Floyd uprising, or during that time. And there was a white militia shooter, fully, you can see that he was armed. And I was saying, hey, can the police help? And the Black folks were like, what are you asking the police to help for? We know that they don't protect us. But in my head, I was still thinking like, oh, you know what, they're supposed to help. And I'm an abolitionist, and in my head, I was still thinking that. But I'm sharing that story to say that it became really real for me, because if they shot at the Southeast Asian folks who were helping out there, and we were in the march and we were security, if they shot one of those, they came as volunteers. And so am I liable for their lives? If they came as volunteers, if they came as allies, if they came as people who were part of the protest, then I quickly realized if I'm asking you to come out, you're coming out because your liberation is tied to the fight. And so if you get shot at because people are going to get shot at, then you don't have anyone to blame, because you're actually out here for yourself. You're fighting for you, and your liberation is tied to the fight right now. And so my new thing is, it's not enough to be an ally. It's not enough to be family. That actually we need, as Asian Americans, to figure out what is and how is our liberation tied to the Black Power movement. And that is when we show up, and if we get shot up and if we get killed, then it's part of our fight, and then it's not anyone to blame. And on top of that, what I've learned is, in living in 40 years of my life in this country, Black people don't need Asian people to save them. They've been saving us, saving them, saving the, you know what I mean? So that's one of the things that I learned. I was like, okay, so this savior complex, people have that. How can we be allies and not have that? And so that's why I'm pushing for, how is your liberation tied to Black movements and those most impacted? And so when you're showing up, you're not just showing up as an ally, but you really understand how your struggle is tied to their struggle, and your freedom is tied to their freedom.
That is so, so true. I love what you said. And Ed's story and your story resonates with me. And I like what you said about building community, because I think that needs to be the theme of this event. How do we build it? And the term ally, when I say that term, I think about watching over someone else's back. I think about, how do we have enough understanding and empathy to be an ally? What is my history, and how does my history of how I understand myself as a Chinese and as an American, how does that fit into the Black community? What do I know about our connections of our history, our connections of what is it like to be discriminated against? And to recognize ourselves as minorities, what makes us similar and what makes us different, because I think both are really crucial to working together. So it's for me, it's a matter of looking at our own moral code. What is, who are we, and what side am I on? Am I on the right side or the wrong side? Am I implicit when I don't say anything or think anything? I don't notice anything. So it's, and sometimes when I talk to younger folks, kids, I ask them about, when I talk to them about Star Wars, and what side do I want to be on, the right side or the wrong side? And we have to choose. We have to figure out where our moral code is, and then you act on it. And it doesn't have to be, to me, anything really important that I have to stand on stage and say something. It's the little things, it's the attitudes. And so for me to be an ally, I need to recognize that we all are in it together. and that when we work together for the greater good, it's better than if we're doing it alone, because we're going to need each other. We can't do it by ourselves. And another thing that I think is important for me, having been in the civil rights movement for so long, is that people who say, yeah, Black lives matter, but we all matter. And my answer to that is, but why not Black lives matter? It's amazing how much we all benefit from the Black movement. The Blacks have endured discrimination for 400 years. Asians, maybe 170 years. Maybe Asians on and off. It's really important that we recognize that we've been this, we've got horrific stuff done to us from the 1800s, late 1800s through the 1900s. But it's in and out. For the Blacks, it's been continuous. It's just ongoing. And I think we need to recognize each other's needs and how we need to just recognize that we have to be working together on this. And it's all, a lot of Asians have been through a lot in the United States. But I think as an Asian American, my daughter said once to me a couple of years ago, I said, what are you thankful for? And one of the first things that came out of her mouth was, I'm sure glad I'm not African American. But she really was able to identify with what it's like to struggle as a minority. And then what I like to see more of is how we can struggle together and make a voice together, that we're one voice and we need to be together to work this through.
Great.
I wanted to also add, it was my great privilege to work for many years with Native communities, mostly in the United States. And one of the many things I learned was the importance of listening. That I think the history of Native communities on this continent has really been, at many times, the struggling against the imposition of somebody else's agenda. And I mean, whether that was being a barrier to development or exploitation, or even in the more well-meaning versions, the imposition of programs for the benefit of Native peoples. I mean, and I think we on the left, as well as those in the center and right, have to be very careful about what's imposed. And I think that over the years, I mean, we did a lot of work in a lot of places related to treaty rights in the Dakotas and fishing rights in the Northwest and land rights, land claims in New England, and Native prisoners in California. And I think our major task was to help build and sustain community. And these are communities that have withstood, the worst intentions of this country, beginning with extermination. And I think so we have a lot to learn here. And humility is always a good thing, just in general. But I think in terms of alliances, I think early on, I sensed that even among progressives, I mean, there was a sense that, we shared a material condition, i.e. poverty, oppression, racism, all true. But we also leaped from that recognition to figuring that, okay, they're like us. Yes, they are like us, but they're also different. They have struggles about Native, their sovereignty. about their land rights, about their histories, their land-based histories on this continent. And I think we have to hear that. And I think increasingly that is being heard. And I appreciated, for example, at the beginning of this program, you know, the acknowledgement of whose land we're on, which a few years ago that would have never been heard. And I think our understandings based on the struggles at Standing Rock and other places are also part of that. But in any case, listening is very, very important.
Absolutely. I know that there's like, you know, really enjoying this conversation. There's many more things that we can talk about, right? As a group, but also just keep an eye on the time. I actually want to build upon this last sort of conversation that we've just been having and get to a question that I also hear students ask a lot. And that is the question of what are some of the strategies to both build and sustain a movement, right? I know a lot of students are really, you know, inspired and want to get involved, and they ask questions related to burnouts or about the impacts, you know, how do we actually make institutional change without getting discouraged? And I think for organizing in the 21st century, there's the internet and social media at play. And so I was wondering if any of you had some thoughts about, you know, 21st century activism, right?
Well, let me let me say something else. You know, it's a long struggle. It's not going to be resolved or changed, you know, in a single campaign or a decade of campaigns. And I think people have to be both in sensing their own solidarity and working out agendas. They should be kind to each other. That we, you know, we're in this together, and we're going to be in this together for a long time if we need to change this country into the way that we want it to be changed. And I think we shouldn't, you know, slice ourselves up in that process. We should understand what it takes to do it on the long term, and I, you know, obey our best impulses, not our worst ones.
Great. Any other thoughts?
Are you talking about organizing?
Yeah, I mean, like building a grassroots movement, you know, in whatever form, right? So that could be raising consciousness, right? That could be an outright, you know, organization or a particular movement. So I'm asking sort of more broadly, right? How do we, you know, make change, right? How do we get something to happen?
In this century?
In this century, yes, in this moment.
Some of us have to learn how to do TikTok. We are not a generation of TikTok. We are not a generation of social influencers. No offense to social influencers, but I think that people need to put in some work. I think that if you're gonna be influencing, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, because with one TikTok, you can actually influence that many people. People have a responsibility to educate themselves, to learn the history. I think what I'm learning from Ed and Marion is that what has worked to move and to build and to change hearts and minds of people in this country, specifically if we're talking about Asian Americans, is that it's not enough for you just to be able to be a social media influencer. I think it's important for you all to get some social justice history, to study the history of Asian Americans, to study your own history. Because what happens is that when you have that much influence over people, I'm demanding that you also educate yourself so that we're not putting out false narratives, and that it's important that we stand, like Marion said, we stand on the right side of history. And what happens when you don't know your history, what happens when you don't know your struggle, is that you're not on the right side of history and you're influencing a lot of people, and that's detrimental to our movement. So I would say that. I would say that you have to use social media and social platforms in a responsible way. And I say that because I have children, and if they're going to be following you, I want you to at least be teaching them things that I don't have to come and undo, number one. And then the other piece is that I think that we have a real opportunity here to reach millions of people with our messaging. And so I think that young people and people who are really savvy in this area, I think that getting like Marion's narrative and story out, Ed's story out, like these are the kind of things. What do we do? How can we use this time and these platforms to uplift the narrative of Asian Americans, our contributions to this country? And I think one of the things that as a Southeast Asian woman, as a Hmong woman, as Asian American leaders, is that we often are the backbone and our stories are not told. And then we feel like, you know, we're invisible. We have platforms and we have people who can use those, and it's time to use it in a responsible way, and it's time to educate our people and to uplift our own people and our own narratives. And so I really believe that like we've contributed greatly to this country, whether you've been here 150 years, your ancestors have been here 150 years, or your ancestors have been here, or we've been here for 40 years. We are part of the fabric of this country. And there are many of us who have been on the right side of history, and those narratives need to be told.
Also, you know, that's really important because we're talking about principles. We're talking about personal beliefs. You have, you know, I think it sort of grows slowly. It grew slowly for me. My consciousness raising took many, many years, but I don't have to wait until I got it to get involved. You get involved now. And I think I join groups only when these groups fits my own values, my own moral outlook, my own beliefs in how would I want to see this place a lot safer and more equal, where there is actually a functioning group that's really working, that I believe in. So I was thinking more of the idea of, no, we hadn't talked about, you know, what we're more comfortable with. The organization I'm with, which is the Bay Area Veterans of the Civil Rights Movement, we talk quite a bit about violence and nonviolence. That's, I guess, another part of what kind of group do you want that can sustain you? Where do you feel about being violent? Do you want violent tactics, or do you want to be in a group where you advocate nonviolence, which is more effective in the long term? Or do you want immediate gratification, break windows, start yelling at people so that they will hate you? You know, what kind of involvement do you want to find yourself into? And another thing I'm thinking about is that you save the world one step at a time. Change comes very slow, but whenever you think you're losing, do not lose the lesson. Do not lose the cause of what you want to be about. There are times when many students, when I talk to groups, there was a really bright young Asian kid in the 6th grade, and she said, how come you're here talking about civil rights? Because didn't the Civil Rights Bill already pass a long time ago? And that was a beautiful question. And one of the things I tend to say is that, you know, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. You have to keep working, and every generation has to bring up your own way of fighting. But every generation needs a revolution. And what happened with our 60s movement, we brought it to this generation, and this generation has to find your own way of how to build your own on top of ours so that it can continue, because it doesn't end. And we, with the new incoming, exciting new coming 2021, administration of the United States, it doesn't mean that we have done our job. You can't sit and say my battle has been won. It's never won. I think my experience has been the important thing for me has always been, no, there's no light at the end of the tunnel, but I have to be there working on it all the time. It is an ongoing process.
Great. Yeah, thank you all so much. I think what I want to do now is actually shift to some of the questions that have come through, right? So thank you all for sharing your thoughts and experiences. And so let me start with some of the questions that I have, from the audience. And so one question hitting a topic that we didn't get a chance to cover during our panel comes from one of our students, Angela Lee, who's the director of the Asian Pacific Coalition at UCLA. And so this first question is, how was cross-community solidarity changed? How has it changed over the years? What lessons should we be taking from the past in how we approach advocacy and allyship in the present? So, how have things changed over the years in terms of that cross-community solidarity?
Well, for me, one quick answer is it's gotten better. I mean, there is some. There wasn't any before. There was very little. And, there were isolated individuals. I guess I'm one of them who, parachuted in on in a specific situation. But I think there's now some activity and some vocabulary about that very phenomenon, and it's it has a lot of rough spots, but it exists now to a degree that it didn't before, and I think that ought to be noted.
Right. Any other thoughts about how some of this, organizing and solidarity building has changed over the years?
Can I maybe I would like to share a story of what it was like in the 60s as an Asian American, because all of us who were speaking, and I think we sort of stand out like a sore thumb. As an Asian American, I think it's important to speak as an Asian American in the civil rights movement, because nobody understands it as the way some of us who are there are only a few of us Asian Americans in the civil rights movement. There are mostly, in 1964, the Freedom Summer, there were over 800 to 900 civil rights workers who came from the North, mostly college agers, mostly white, some blacks, and hardly any Chinese or Asian. And what happened then, we were like a new commodity. Nobody expected us. It's what Ed was saying, that it's people don't know what to do with us. But that can be to our advantage. So let me quickly say, if you don't mind, I don't know how much time we have. On my first day on the job, I like to talk about what it was like to be Asian American in the movement. It happened at a courthouse in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. A fellow civil rights worker was arrested because he was walking alone on a highway, and the police, knowing he was an outsider, a northerner, an agitator, a troublemaker, he was put in jail right away. And as soon as you're in jail, it's really dangerous to be an outsider in jail. So we needed to be at his trial to try and get him out. And so there were 10 of us who walked in. to the courthouse, whites, blacks, and then there was me. So we needed to be at this trial. And we sat on the first row when we got into the courthouse. It happened to be the white section, and we were integrated. So we sat in the white section. We were not supposed to do that. The trial could not start until people were seated in their proper sections. So the deputy approached each one of us who were not white and said to each Negro, you have to move to the colored section. And as each Negro was saying, or civil rights worker, each of our black civil rights worker replied, no, I'm not moving. And that was a direct challenge to the courts. And each one of them, by the time they got to me, the deputy sheriff sort of froze in front of me. And I was sitting there looking at him and waiting for him to do something. He didn't know what to do with me because I wasn't white, I wasn't black. And I just sat there and looked at him. And the sheriff finally walked to the back where the judge stood. And they began whispering quietly among each other for about a minute. And everybody was really silent, waiting to see how the ball was going to be dropped. Finally, the deputy sheriff returned to the front of the courthouse and announced to everybody, this case is dismissed. Dismissed the entire case because they didn't know what to do with me. If I had known that this case could be dismissed that easily, I could have gone to every trial there was in the South and see if I could get people dismissed. And it was like what Ed was saying earlier, it was like, it's amazing that that happened. And I think for that moment, the conscience of the nation, at least for Hattiesburg, was in limbo, and we got our fellow civil rights worker freed. And this is the irony of racism. It's what Ed was saying, how ridiculous it is that we can use race to belittle and discriminate against anybody, just to use it as a playing tool for power. And it's not about color. It's about human dignity and about equal rights. It's not about color. It's not about something nonsense as color. We created that. The United States created that. And so I think we need to be cognizant of that when we talk about what is the purpose of a movement, how do you sustain a movement. I think we need to not be reminded that this is a human issue, it's a human rights issue, it's a human dignity issue. So if it happens to one group of people, whether you can be gay or straight, indigenous people or Muslim, Buddhist, Christian, it doesn't matter. It's justice that people haven't been able to get it because of that. So I think that as Asians, we really matter, that we can make a real difference in it. And it can be one, it can be 100 of us, but this is a really important period where we can be more visible. So one of the challenges I see as Asian Americans across the country is not only being visible, but we need to be heard. And we need to do that stronger. And I'm really so happy to see so many young Asian Americans nowadays speaking out and getting into places of leadership where you can say it the way you want to say it and not be told how to say it.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much.
Could I add a point here?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I would say also that I became an Asian American because of the civil rights movement, or through the civil rights movement. In other words, when I was working in the South, consciousness about Asian identity was not, shall we say, a sharp point. But I think as you get immersed in the struggle for racial equality and understand more about the culture and the country we live in, and then sort of feedback on the experiences that you had lived through but never had really analyzed, like the internment. I think that's where my consciousness came through. So I think that point ought to be made too, that for a number of us, I mean, it wasn't that we became we were Asian American and because of that we went into the movement. We went into the movement and then became Asian Americans. And I think that's an accurate description of what happened.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that point. I have actually two questions that are sort of similar, and so I'm going to sort of rephrase them and put them into one. And so it's really aimed at Kabzuag about anti-Blackness. And so the question are really about how is anti-Blackness sort of, how do you deal with it in organizing and building solidarities, particularly between Southeast Asian and Black communities in your work like that you do at Freedom Inc. But also more broadly, Emily also has a question related to how do we dismantle anti-Blackness, particularly within the Asian American community?
So this is such an important question, and this is something that I wake up every day and always try to dismantle my own anti-Blackness. And I say that to say, in the gender justice world, we ask that men wake up every day because gender injustice and gender equity needs men to wake up every day and dismantle patriarchy. And so I learned that from my friend Peng in his work to end gender justice. And so I wake up every day and try to dismantle my own anti-Blackness. In our work at Freedom Inc., for a long time, we thought since we had shared oppression and we lived in the same communities that automatically the Southeast Asian folks would understand anti-Blackness. And what I've learned is that's absolutely not true. And so one of the things that we've learned here at Freedom Inc. is, because we're not Black, there are many things that we do that are inherently just anti-Black. And so we've learned we're learning to put in place policies that protect Black people from us when we're just nice Asian folks who are trying to do good. But the anti-Blackness piece is that's an inherently, because of white supremacy, that is just something that we're taught, and that is just something that as Asian Americans, whether we like it or not, we're part of that system. And so some of the things that I think what I've learned, and that's been really helpful for me in dismantling anti-Blackness, is that during the George Floyd and even Mike Brown situations and throughout my life, I try not to unfriend people on Facebook. I try not to unfriend people in real life who are close to me if they are anti-Black or if they are saying things that or believe things that are anti-Black. And the reason why I do that is because these same family members, these same people, Black people have to interact with them. And so who better to dismantle and who better to teach them if they're your family members than you? So why should another Black person be on the receiving end of that if that is somebody that you care about? And I'm gonna give Tu Tao as an example. He is the officer who stood by as the other officer put his knee on George Floyd's neck and killed him. And the reason I say our complicity in teaching and helping our people understand anti-Blackness, Tu Tao is a great example of what can happen to Black people when you're complicit and when you're just a nice person doing your job. It's not enough, and anti-Blackness kills, and we as Asian Americans cannot be part of that system. And then the other piece, so the other thing that one, stay engaged with your own people. Two, wake up every day and dismantle your own anti-Blackness. I always say to myself that I hope I have not made such a big mistake in harming Black people with my anti-Blackness that I can't come back from. And so it's not whether you're not going to make a mistake or not, you are going to make a mistake, but can those mistakes be minimal so that it's not so detrimental to the community and to Black people within your life that you really love. And then, the other thing is I used to think that it was enough to just understand and be in fight with, but what I'm learning is how is my liberation tied? What is my fight? I'll give you an example. Defunding police. I can't look at defunding police as a Black issue. Defunding police is a Southeast Asian issue. It is a Hmong issue. It is an Asian American issue. If they defund the police and fund education, don't you think as an Asian American, your children and your loved ones are going to benefit from that? Then why must Black people fight for that while you are on the sideline? And so as an Asian American or as a Hmong person whose children can greatly benefit from funding other resources, funding other services, why should I stand on the sideline? And so I'm learning that my freedom and my liberation is that I'm not an ally and I'm not trying to just stand in solidarity, which you can do that too, but I'm learning to tell my story and what it is that I need and what am I willing to put on the line. And so no longer is it okay for us as Asian Americans to be on the sideline and to hold up signs. We also have to figure out what is this fight and what does it look like for us as Asian Americans. And so those are the kind of things, but there's so many stories at Freedom Inc. And in my line of work. And I can tell you all, honestly, we've made so many mistakes as Asian Americans, as Hmong people. We've done a lot of anti-Black stuff, even within my own organization. The best example I can give you is something as minimal, where we have colorism, in our agency, something as simple as a food pantry program. I'm going to tell you this real quick. We had a food pantry program, and the first people, it was on Friday. And on Thursday night, the Hmong families would get their food because they had programming that night. And then Friday morning, the Khmer folks would get their food. And then by 1 p.m. Friday afternoon, it was the Black folks' turn. And it just so happened because programming was set up that way. And our Black staffs and the Black community was like, by the time it got to us, there was nothing left. But we just saw it as us being like accommodating to our community. We just saw it as like, we're really nice people. Of course, that wasn't something that we thought about, but anti-Blackness can be that subtle and it could be that harmful to a community. And so I just say to you all, like, put in place in your own life and in your organizations, in your institutions, policies and protocols to protect Black people from you while we're trying to figure this shit out.
Great, thank you so much. Kabzuag, there's actually also one other question that I think is really relevant to a lot of people who are in the audience right now. This is Sheila's question, and that is, what role can academics and students play in the movement right now?
Okay, so number one, if you're gonna do research on people, make sure that the research benefits the community that you're doing research on, number one. Number two, make sure you have a way of giving that information back that's helpful, that benefits the people that you're researching. And so I think that's one of the things. And then also, like, you have access to resources that community folks don't have. Like, make sure that you're spreading that resource out. And the other thing is that we know that education should not be a privilege, that education should be free, higher education should be free to everybody. And so one of the things that I really value is that just because you're educated doesn't mean you're wise. And so if you have the opportunity to be educated, like, give back to your community. So give back and make sure that your research is useful to the people that you're researching.
What about students? I know that a lot of times, again, I get students who are just like, I'm fired up, what do I do, right? So what can students do?
Organize, do student organizing, make changes where you can. If not, volunteer. There's a lot of like great organizations throughout the community. Do some volunteering, get some knowledge in, like put in some work.
Great. I know we are rapidly running out of time, so I actually want to open it up to our three panelists and see if there's any like last thoughts, words of wisdom that they want to share with the audience before we close out.
I don't think I have much wisdom except that don't be afraid of differences. That there are, Eastern cultures are different from Western cultures. Eastern cultures could be more quiet, introspective. Western cultures could be loud and brassy and swearing. And they all belong to the fabric of our country. And we are beginning to be a nation of immigrants. There's no longer going to be in a few years a minority. There's no white male minority majority anymore. We're all going to be a land of immigrants. That's the trend. And the feeling of belonging, that we are not perpetual foreigners. We belong here. And we have a right to be responsible for each other. And that we are a family, a world family, international family. And to get to know who we are as a race, but other people, and to see our differences on the similarities and not to be afraid of it.
Great, thanks.
I'm optimistic by nature, but I'm also, I think, have some validation in terms of what's happened and what may yet happen. And I would like to, I think we're going to be entering another stage in which Asian Americans and Native Americans and African Americans and Latinos and LGBTQ community people and women are going to be part of another American saga. I think we've spent a good deal of our lives, right, I'm speaking for myself, in kind of a process of deconstruction, of sort of knocking down the mythology of who rules and why they rule and why we ought to kick their ass. But I think what's going to develop, and I think what students here and elsewhere are going to be engaged in, is what is this thing that we are constructing what is this America that we're a part of that's going to be better, more just, more democratic? I think that's a task for this next generation.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
So no, I mean, I don't know if it's words of wisdom, but I'm really inspired by the young people who are unafraid. I'm really inspired by Southeast Asian like organizers who are bringing their families back from Cambodia. I'm really inspired by young queer Southeast Asian folks who are just putting their bodies on the line and in the streets. I know that many of my people have been in the streets for months because their liberation is tied to Black lives. And so I think that one of the things that I would leave is be unafraid, be on the right side of history. And not only do we need to fight and support Black lives, but within the Asian American diaspora, to understand that many of us do not have the same privileges. Southeast Asian folks are not making it in this country. I often make fun of this, but in fact, we are what makes the Asian American model minority a myth, the myth. And so I think that it's important that we look at Southeast Asians and our struggle, and for all Asian Americans to support that struggle, and that we are not making it, and that our families are failing, and that we are our population is highly incarcerated, our children are failing. We are actually, it's said that in Minnesota, 1 in every 2 people who test for COVID test positive. in one of the counties. And so we are dying in our numbers, and we're not seeing those numbers right now, but we are disproportionately impacted by this country. And so I would put that message out to you all, and that as we are trying to be pro-Black and dismantle anti-Blackness, we also need to dismantle colorism in Asian American communities. And we also need to support South Asian immigrants. We need to support Southeast Asian refugees, those who are being deported, those who are incarcerated. And so that is my last message to this panel and to everybody who's listening.
Great, thank you so much. I really enjoyed hearing what everyone had to say, and I can tell from the comments in the chat that the audience is also incredibly inspired. So thank you so much. So I also, to close up, I want to give a special thanks to Eastwind Easing, right, and Eddie Wong, and you can check out Eastwind at their website. This also concludes our program, and we hope that the program was enjoyable for you. For those of you who are registered, we will send you an email with the recording information as well as information on upcoming events. And thank you everyone. Please be safe, and we hope to see you again. Thanks.